So I just finished this solid birch coffee table. And believe it or not, this is my first table I've ever built. It's not big, but still, it's a learning experience for me. I did the base without any fasteners whatsoever. Actually, the only fasteners on this whole thing are Z-clips to hold the tabletop on. I didn't even really need those. I just never tried them before and heard a lot about them. So yeah, have a watch. Let me know what you think. And maybe next time this table will be much bigger. So I've been wanting to make a coffee table for a little while now, and just so happens I came across this nice 2-inch thick, about 10-year-old birch that a neighbor of mine had kicking around. So I got it from him. I really like the markings in the middle of this, so I want to incorporate that. I'm going to spend a bit of time here mapping out where my cuts are. I want to save as much wood as I can, but like I said, I really want this piece here to play sort of like an eye-catching center role. So probably spend a little more time than I need milling up, but it'll be worth it for sure. So I get my slab ready and I sweep it off and make sure there's no rocks or sand from where it was stored before I cut it. Flip it over. I want to make sure I use the most narrow side. Since this is a round tree, there's a good chance one side has a little more bark on it than the other. So I just take my straight edge and make a nice little straight line that I'll be able to follow with my circular saw. So I use my circular saw just to give myself one straight edge. I'm going to cut up all my pieces right now at this point so I can start squaring them up through the table saw using this new side I just cut. I put my fresh cut side against the fence and just line it up so I take off the least amount of material as possible and run it through my table saw. I'm going to flip it over and cut the first side a second time just because I know I can get a little straighter cut on my table saw than I can with the circular saw. Now that I've got two pieces squared up, I'm just going to lay them out and just kind of get an idea what this is going to look like. I'm going to cut it down into smaller pieces. I just tend to like the look of having multiple smaller pieces than one great big slab. Once I decide how it's going to look, I'm going to go back to the table saw and cut them into smaller pieces. Now that I've got them cut into smaller strips, I'm going to play with them a little more. I actually really enjoy this part of just moving the grains around and seeing what I really like. So once I come up with that, I'm just going to make some marks on the board so I can keep them in order. Once I decide how it's going to look, I'm going to take them over to the joiner. I'm going to give them two straight edges and one flat face so I can take them over to the planer after. Just remember, if you made a mark, to keep everything in order, to make another mark once you plane it off. Just helps keep track of things. Then I've got one side left to run through the planer and everything's nice and square. At this point, I'm going to lay everything back out the way I want it, and I'm going to use dowels to align this up. Not something I use all the time, but I want to make sure that I have minimal sanding at the end of this. So I'm going to use a little dowel jig that I have and make some marks along the boards to line everything up. Now, one thing I didn't do here that I should have was kind of take into account of what my final length is going to be. You'll see here later on in the video what that's going to do to me. I got a couple extra holes here in mine. Honestly, that was my first time using a little dowel jig. They're very easy, but they're even easier if you read the instructions fully. No big deal though, those will be buried in the table, no one will ever see them. So I just put my dowels in, add some glue, and clamp everything together. I'm using some cawls on the end of my glue up as well this time. Not something I paid a whole lot of attention to earlier on, but I gotta say, these do help a lot, keeping everything nice and flat. While I'm waiting for my top to dry, I'm going to start ripping some pieces for my rails and my legs. So I just grab another one of the slabs I already edged up earlier, and I'm going to go with about 1.75 inch thick leg. I'm going to taper it down when using the taper jig. And my rails are just going to be a thin 1/2 inch, roughly about 2-inch wide rail. For my tapered legs, I'm using this jig that I've made. Makes it very easy. Makes it easy to repeat the same cut over and over as well. I do have a video on that, so check that out. So I've got the overall length of my leg, which is going to be 18 inches, and I just kind of do something that looks nice to the eye. Every time I do a tapered leg, it's a little different. I just make a mark and bring it down to about 2/3 of the width at that mark. So here it's 1 3/4 down to an inch. And I taper 2 sides out of the 4. I think that just gives it a real nice sharp look. I want to set the rails down into the legs themselves. I don't want to use any fasteners on this, so I've set my router taper up to come 1/2 inch out from the fence and to go 1/2 inch deep. This is going to give me kind of an L-shaped cut on the top of my legs for the rails to sit into nice and secure. Now, since my router bit is round, I got to take my chisel and just square up the ends of the cuts. With my legs done, I move back onto my rails. I'm going to use Z-clips this time for this table. I've never used them before. I've heard them talked about quite a bit, so I thought I'd give them a try. And they're pretty easy to do. I just took my 1/2 inch rails, set the depth of my saw, and put an 1/8 of an inch groove down along the ends of them. Once that was done, I just cut them to length. Then I sand all my legs and rails. It's much easier to sand them now than when they're all glued together. I'm only gluing up one side at a time. I find it much easier to square everything up and make little minor adjustments. But at this point here, I kind of realized too that I didn't like how thin the top of my table legs were after I routed them out. There wasn't a whole lot of wood left on the back side, and I kind of questioned how strong they'd be. So I'm going to make a secondary piece to go in behind that to make sure everything stays nice and solid here. With the 2 longer sides dry, I just need to add my 2 remaining rails. I cut a center brace and 2 end pieces to mate up against the existing rail for extra strength, and glued everything and clamped it up. With that done, I squared up my tabletop and filled the voids and cracks with a black epoxy. With the holes filled and everything squared up, it was time for the final sand. Remember earlier when I mentioned the dowel location? Yeah, well, this is where it bit me. On the final sand, I was sanding the edge and I found a dowel. Finding that on the final sand was a bit frustrating, but that stuff happens. So I just went right to work and started chiseling out the hole to make it nice and square. And I'm going to look around for a piece of wood to try to match up best I can and just try my hand at hiding this. I took my time. I made up a little bit of a glue and sawdust mixture with the shavings from this table, so it should match pretty good. I let the glue dry and then took my saw and cut it off as flush as I could, grabbed my sander, and was actually pleasantly surprised at how well that turned out. I'm going to finish sanding my tabletop, then I'm going to sand the base one more time and get ready for the finish. I'm using a hard wax for the finish on this, and once I get it rubbed in by hand, I'm going to take this polisher and give it a nice buffing. I secure the base to the top using the Z-clips, and I'm all done. Thanks for watching. Please take a second and just hit that like and or subscribe button. It really makes a big difference for a small channel like mine. Have a good one.